Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of SciChat. SciChat, of course, is a weekly, well, it's two parts really. It's a weekly video webinar that we record and put up on Monday mornings on our Facebook group, which is Facebook slash group slash side chat, something along those lines. If you search side chat in Facebook, you'll find it. And the other half of it, though, is that Facebook group, right? So when we post the videos every week, 30 minutes of data about some topic to that group, then there's a discussion in the group with a bunch of others scientifically minded, analytically minded, those who are interested in applying the scientific method to marketing, discussion about that topic and about other topics in marketing. So while I think that my content is awesome, that's why I do it, that's why I love doing it, I think it's more awesome is the community and is the hundreds and hundreds of smart people that we have in the Facebook group who are ready to discuss and answer your questions, ask you questions, and kind of move the ball forward down the field of scientific marketing. And so, like I said, every week we do one of these videos. It'll be about a different topic. This week's topic is actually going to be timing. Right, and I have a bunch of data about timing. And I think it's always one of the, it was one of the first things I started studying when I started doing social media science and marketing science, and it's typically been one of my most quoted data points, right? It's whenever I do anything about timing, that's the data that gets talked about, blogged about, tweeted about, whatever, about the most, or it's amongst the groups of data that I do that get talked about the most. So it's appreciated, but there are several caveats that we have to keep in mind when we're looking at timing data, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit, but I just kind of wanted to say that's what the topic is going to be this week, science of timing. I figured it would be apropos because this week, of course, is New Year's and New Year's Eve, and so it's a time to think about time and to think about the year past and the year forward. So with that in mind, let's get into a discussion of the scientific study of timing as it relates to social media and internet marketing in general. Now, I call myself a social media scientist, right? I do that. That's actually literally my official title at HubSpot, a social media scientist. And I call myself that because I go to a lot of marketing conferences, read a lot of marketing books and blogs, and I hear a lot of advice in marketing in general, but in social media specifically, that is unicorns and rainbows advice, right? And so I'd like to take a scientific approach to marketing and go beyond the unicorns and rainbows, superstitions and myths, right? So what I call unicorns and rainbows is stuff like be awesome, engage in the conversation, have a personality, right? That stuff is hard to disagree with, because I'm not going to come up here and tell you to punch your customers in the face, but it's not particularly useful in that a piece of advice like be awesome, you're not trying to be unawesome, right? Like you're not currently trying to not be awesome. So for somebody to tell you to be awesome, it's just, greasy snake oil stuff that it's like horoscopes, right? Everybody agrees with their horoscope because it's so vague and everybody, it's a positive sentiment. Everybody kind of agrees with it, even though you stop and you realize that, hey, you're just being pandered to when you're given advice like that. And it's also not based on anything more substantial than exactly that, than what feels right, what's truthy, to borrow Stephen Colbert's phrase. So as a social media scientist, I try to help you do your marketing by using large data sets to uncover best practices, to uncover large aggregate averages, means, medians, trends in the behavior of people online. And then I try to use that to teach you how to leverage those behaviors. So that's part of what the focus of the content that I'm producing is it's twofold, really. One is to suggest to you some things you may want to experiment with. And I'm going to get into that in a second. The other goal of the kind of content that I produce is to stimulate you to think about marketing in a scientific way, to start to question those unicorns and rainbow superstitions, right? When you hear something that sounds, not that it sounds too good to be true, but it sounds too fluffy, right? Too kumbaya, too agreeable, I think, is really the key, right? Because if everything that somebody says, you're a marketing speaker, and if you agree with every single thing they say, they're probably just saying things that don't mean anything, but are just easy to agree with, right? So if somebody says be awesome, like, yeah, totally, you should be awesome. But that you're not saying anything. That doesn't mean anything. Somebody rails against QR codes. That doesn't. Who thinks QR codes are a good idea? Right? It's just a cheap ploy, cheap trick, just to kind of win over a crowd. As I've seen through the SciChat Facebook group, there is a large percentage of the marketing community, and I believe you are part of it, that is smarter than that. And so rather than pander, I want and accept pandering. I want you guys to question these things, to do your own data, do your own science. Maybe it's not big data like I'm using. Maybe it's just experimentation on your own traffic, which at the end of the day, for your results, is going to be the best thing for you to do. So with that said, the other caveat that we really have to understand, especially when we're talking about timing data, but really when you're talking about any kind of marketing data that comes from large data sets, think about science in general as split into two buckets. There's other buckets, but just imagine that there's two buckets for rhetorical sake. One is physics, math, right? The idea is that in gravity is going to work the same anywhere in the world, right? Or anywhere in the universe, for instance. It's a formula based on the mass of the planet you're on. And then, so that's always, there's a formula that'll determine what the force is. And so if you drop something in any place in the universe, gravity is always going to work the same. And you can always exactly predict how fast the object's going to fall. That's physical science, right? And there are some complexities to it. But for the most part, when you get to just a one force, one formula, there's laws that can be applied and that work in every single case. On the other hand, you have sciences like medicine, healthcare. What you have, the way that kind of science works is that, say there's a disease, and researchers or a problem, researchers at universities, academic type folks will do in labs, will do research using hundreds of subjects, maybe thousands of subjects, and will attempt a new drug, a new therapy, a new treatment, whatever it is, on those subjects, and they'll come up with a course of treatment that works for the largest number of people in that group while minimizing side effects. But then in individual cases, individual doctors will look at the body of research that has been done about a specific problem that their patient has, and they'll start with the most indicated course of treatment. They'll apply it. If it works, great. If it doesn't, because it might not work for everybody because the human system is very, very complex and everybody's different, then they'll try the next most indicated course of treatment. If that works, great. If not, they try the third most indicated. Okay. I mean, and typically, you talk about minimizing side effects and all that kind of stuff, but that's the metaphor that you need to think about when you're using marketing data. You, as the marketer trying to get results for your company or your brand, are like the doctor applying data, applying research to best practice courses of, to an individual patient, right? The patient being your brand. And so what I do is I present data based in aggregates across multiple industries, multiple time zones, multiple brands, multiple, types of business, types of markets, and I present those findings to you. You, in individual cases, need to take what I'm suggesting to you and try it, and if it works, great. If it doesn't, don't think there's something wrong with you. Just understand that your, case is more individual, and experiment with something else. Okay, and so that's really what I'm trying to give you with timing data, is not a set in stone set of rules to abide by, but a suggestion of several potentially counterintuitive suggestions to experiment with. Right? So if I can come up with a data-backed suggestion of, post at XYZ time, and that's different from what you're doing now, I've given you something new to experiment with. And in a lot of these cases, I'll hear back from people, when we talk about the weekend, or we talk about off-peak timing, etc. When I'll tell people, they'll hear my data about timing, and they will be surprised when they try something and it works, right? I get that feedback quite a bit. So again, this doesn't mean to take what I'm saying as some kind of law or gospel. It's not. They're just experiments based, or experimental suggestions based in my very large data sets. Now, another thing you have to understand when I talk about timing and time-based data is that I'm speaking generally in Eastern Standard Time, right, or Eastern Daylight Time, but Eastern Time, and I do that for a number of reasons. The most important reason is that most people, for instance, in the U.S., are on that time zone. right? So I standardize all of the data that I have from the various data sorts to Eastern time, and that's what I'm presenting to you. Because especially when you're talking about an American market, most of the people are in Eastern time or Central time, and so it just kind of makes sense to orient in that direction rather than to. And I live in Pacific time. I live in Las Vegas, so I get that it's 3 hours different, but I've just picked Eastern time to standardize on. So understand that when I'm presenting something like this to you, that I am presenting it in Eastern time. So this is perhaps one of my most talked about bits of data that I've produced over the years that I've been doing social media science. And what this is a measure of retweets by hour. Right, so essentially the retweetability of certain times of day, of certain hours of the day. And what you find is that Twitter in general exhibits this diurnal pattern that is awake during the day and asleep at night. And especially when you're talking about the US market, it's very prevalent. Like it is what you see in this graph. But with retweets, the pattern is shifted to the right a little bit, like shifted a little bit later in the day. And meaning that the most retweetable time of day, according to my data, is somewhere between 4 and 5 p.m. Eastern time. Now, I've done this data from a variety of places. I did it several years ago. I've done it much more recently from several different data sources. And I typically come up with the same result. Is roughly that, right before the end of the workday on the East Coast time period. And in fact, I've heard a lot of anecdotal response after having posted this that, yeah, that's true. And in fact, I will notice this on occasion. I'll be working for the day and then I'll tweet something. And, if I'm back on the East Coast, it's 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. Or if I'm, at home in Las Vegas, it's 1 or 2 o'clock. And I post something and it gets a ton of retweets at that time of day. Now, I don't have a great explanation other than the idea that towards the end of the workday, you're just kind of messing around, right? You're a little tired. Your brain might be a little fried. You're not as witty as you were earlier in the day. Your mental energy is sort of probably a little more expended, and so you're just sort of flipping around through Twitter, seeing what's going on, and you're more likely to retweet them, both because you're just sort of screwing around on Twitter, but also because you are not as witty as you would have been earlier in the day when you were thinking of your own tweet. So you're going to be a little bit more likely to retweet rather than create your own tweet. So this, a lot of people will tweet mostly during the day, like noon or 1 or 2 or 3 or before noon. But definitely experiment with tweeting later in the day and even into the early evening to see how this works. This works for you. Now, in any discussion of timing, there's another thing that we really need to talk about, and that is frequency. Right? Frequency is a very important part of the discussion for a number of reasons. One is that what this graph shows, right? So when I looked at a number of very popular Twitter accounts that all used Bitly, because I can use the Bitly API to count the number of clicks that happened to a specific link, right? So if somebody else shortens a link through Bitly, I can then grab that link and then see how many clicks were on that. I'll take the number of clicks that were on that Bitly, divide it by the number of followers, the person who tweeted it, and get a click-through rate. And I'm doing air quotes. I know you can't see me, but I'm doing air quotes around click-through rate there because it's not a traditional click-through rate. Because like if somebody with 100 followers tweets something and then somebody with 10,000 followers retweets it and it gets 1,000 clicks, the click-through rate is going to be 1,000 divided by 100, which is going to be more than 100% click-through rate, right? So, but what I found is that the click-through rates varied wildly across the board for all the accounts, right? There's no standard click-through rate. Right, there's a huge variance in click-through rates. The New York Times is a very low click-through rate. The Kardashians have an extremely high click-through rate, right? So what I did look for is other patterns in which all the click-through rates that were varying wildly decreased because of certain behaviors. And one thing that I found is that if one of these accounts tweeted a link and then didn't tweet another thing for an hour, they had a very high click-through rate, right? But then if they tweeted 2 links in that same hour, they had a much lower click-through rate. 3 links in the same hour, they had an even lower click-through rate, right? And so we see on Twitter that frequency of link tweeting actually tends to decrease the click-through rate on each individual link. And that just makes sense, right? Because I only have so much attention to go around. If I see 500 links fly through my Twitter screen. I'm much less likely to give each one attention than if I just see one that chills there for a little bit. So if you're using other people's content to build your reach on your Twitter account to get more retweets, to get more people to follow you, then great. Tweet that. You can tweet that stuff pretty fast. My data tends to indicate 22 tweets a day is great. But once it becomes time to use that reach to send traffic to your landing pages and to your website, slow it down and tweet fewer times, once an hour, or even slower. But that's when you should slow it down. And then, when I look at, to compare and contrast, when I look at Facebook, and this data set was the 10,000 most liked Facebook pages, and basically all of the posts on those pages, walls that were made by the page themselves. And what I did is I look at posts per day and the number of likes on page likes, right? So the post per day essentially, and how it related to the number of likes that the page had. And what I found is that the most liked pages tended to update around 0.5 times a day, 0.5, 0.6 times a day, somewhere in that range, meaning every other day or a little bit more than every other day, 4 times a week, 5 times a week, or 3 times a week, somewhere in that range, 3 to 6 times a week, or 3 to 5 times a week, excuse me. And I think that's an interesting comparison, because if you look at Twitter posts per day, tweets per day, it tends to be much higher. It tends to be 22 tweets per day. But with Facebook, you have to be a little more careful, right? And so frequency here is a complex issue. You may have heard data from me previously about Twitter that says 22 tweets a day is the best for getting followers, and I stand by that. That it's really hard to overtweet in terms of followers and retweets. But it is possible to overtweet and over Facebook when it comes to getting traffic and getting likes, right? So those are very different motivations, and very different goals. And then when you look at articles published to websites, so articles published on blogs, on news sites, etc., and you compare them to the time of the day that they were posted, right? Or the day of the week that they were posted, and then the number of times that they were liked on Facebook. Facebook liking and sharing of content shared across the web tends to be the highest on Saturdays and Sundays. Meaning, if you post an article on Friday, or if you post an article on Wednesday versus if you post an article on Saturday to your blog or to your news site, your .com, not on Facebook, but your .com, there's going to be more sharing. According to this data, again, this is just the aggregate, the best practice data, not your individual case, but according to best practice data, the article published on Saturday or Sunday is going to get a lot more Facebook likes, Facebook shares. Now, the reason for this is something I call contra-competitive timing, right? So I get tons of email during the work week, essentially, right? I don't read very much of it. I have priority inbox. I only read the important stuff. But on the weekends, I get a lot less email. And what email I do get, I have more chance to read. So I think that's part of what's going on here with Facebook, is that during the work week I'm a little more busy, and on the weekends I have a little more time to just sort of browse around the web and share articles to Facebook and all that kind of thing. So this doesn't mean only post articles that you think are going to do good on Facebook on the weekends, but it definitely does mean experiment with posting on the weekends. Now, when we look at email, one thing that I find really interesting is that when you look at abuse reports, that is the number of times people click essentially report as spam. And the email data here comes from MailChimp. It was a very large email service provider, friends of ours out of Atlanta, and what they did is they gave me access to their data set of 9.5 billion email sends, so a very, very, very large data set. And what I found is that email abuse reports are higher on Saturdays and Sundays. Now, in order to click abuse, to do an abuse report, you basically have to look at the email. The email has to catch your attention. Most people are going to do it from inside the email. And if you look at abuse reports by hour, you see it's really early in the morning. So it's people going through, first thing they do when they get at work, or the first thing they do when they wake up, going through and then clicking spam report, spam report, spam. Now, remember, in order to be an abuse report, two things have to happen. A, your email's got to be terrible, and B, you've got to notice it. And then if you look at bounces by day, again, you see the same kind of pattern. Bounces by hour, it's a similar kind of pattern. It's not as dramatic to earlier in the day. But here's where it gets interesting. Also looking at opens per day. Opens per day spike on Saturdays and Sundays. Emails sent on Saturdays and Sundays tend to get opened more. Saturdays and Sundays, while they are higher with abuse reports and even bounces, they are that way because there is more attention being given to them. There is nothing especially openy about the weekend. There is something about there's a more attention to be given. Contra-competitive timing indicates that on off-peak times, it is easier to get your message heard. So oftentimes when you ask people, when should I send an email, right? When should I tweet? When should I have Facebook? When should I post my article? A lot of times the line of thinking that'll happen is, well, let me figure out when that specific channel is most busy. When are the most people on Twitter? When are the most people on Facebook? The problem with that line of thinking is that if you look for the highest activity peak, overall activity, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be screaming in a room full of people who are also screaming, right? However, if you look for potentially off-peak times where I have a bit more attention to give because the entire world isn't vying for my attention, typically then you can get better response rates. And in this case, it's email opens by hour. Again, you see early in the day. Whenever I do focus groups and ask people about email, they tend to talk about homework and stuff a lot, meaning that like it's kind of a chore. They get in, they slog through it in the morning, and then they get emails throughout the day. So early in the morning does tend to be better as far as getting attention. Again, clicks per day tend to be highest on Saturdays and Sundays. Email sent on the weekends, and clicks per hour tend to indicate that same early morning pattern. What I think is really interesting is then when we go to frequency, and what we find is that a lot of people are scared to over email their lists, right? And what the data says is that when you go from one email sends per month, that's the start of this orange line all the way to the left. The horizontal axis is average sends per month to a list. The vertical axis is click-through rate. Once you go from 1 to 4, right? If you're sending once a week, there is not a big difference in click-through rate between 4 times per week and even really 30 times per week. The data gets a little jerky out there only because there isn't as many email lists sending 30 times, once a day as compared to, companies sending email once a week. But there is no huge drop-off past that. So what I would tell you is send more frequently. When people ask me how much email should I be sending, my response is almost always the same. It is more than you are right now. Because there is, watch your abuse reports, watch your unsubscribes, watch all that stuff. But as long as there's no huge up spike or huge down spike in your metrics, then you're typically going to be okay going more frequently. And remember, if you go from 4 times a month to 8 times a month, okay? And so say, just for argument's sake, you have a 10% click-through when you email 4 times a month, right? And I know 10's a little high, but just to make things simple, right? If you go from 10% click-through rate, sending 4 times a month, and you move to 8 times a month, and your click-through rate drops to 7%, some people would say, look, our click-through rate went down. However, you have to remember that you've doubled the number of times you're sending. So you're still getting more raw clicks at the end of the month than you would had you been sending 4 times a month with a 10% click-through rate, right? But however, if you do that same test and you go from 10% click-through at 4 times a month to 4% click-through at 8 times a month, then you've lost clicks. But until you get to about 5, to half when you're doubling or tripling, you get the third, etc. Generally speaking, the math works out for sending email more often. Okay, and to go a step, and to take that a step further, I don't have the data in here. I thought I might, but I don't have the data in here. Unsubscription rates, basically, people are going to shake out. Once you're sending 4 times a month, people are going to shake out. If they don't want your emails, like if your emails are bad, it doesn't matter if you're sending once a month or 10 times a month, right? If people don't want your email, they don't want any of it. Sending more of it, as long as it's good, has zero to do with, in my data, whether or not people are going to unsubscribe. Right? So, really focus on sending more email. Make it good email, sure, and make sure it's good email, but don't be afraid to send more of it if you have more to say. Right? And then when I asked people in a survey, when do you read blogs? A lot of people told me morning, and then fewer afternoon, fewer evening, fewer night. Again, that's one of the things where blogs, kind of like email, are considered a little bit like homework or the newspaper even. Right? It's a thing you kind of get in, you orient yourself to the day, you read the blogs in your industry, you read your email people have sent you overnight, and then you go about your day. If you look at views by day, that is views of blog posts that were published on different days of the week, you find that Mondays actually tend to be the highest. The weekends aren't terrible, level. Saturday is a little bad, but Sunday is not awful as far as the day to publish. But people, they may have time for other things like push sort of things where, like, they're going to be on Facebook all the time because everybody's on Facebook, and so it does make sense that they're still going to get messages as frequently on Facebook on the weekends, even when they're not checking it actively. And then their email, that's a push thing, right? They're going to check their email no matter what. So if you happen to send on the weekend, it just makes sense because they're just going to have more time. But people aren't necessarily going to think to go to a blog because that's kind of out of their natural thing. So the blog reading is really the kind of thing that's mostly done during the week. Publishing on the weekends isn't a horrible idea. You should certainly want to experiment with it because all the other channel possibilities as far as tweeting and Facebooking and emailing on the weekends. But I would experiment more with posting on Mondays and even towards the end of the week, Thursday and Friday, because those days aren't horrible according to my data set. Now, when we look at views by hour, it's really interesting. Views by hour, that is the hour of the day that the blog post is published and the number of views in that blog post. So you see 10 a.m. it has the highest views. It's, again, because when people get in, they check their email, maybe they have a couple meetings, have a cup of coffee, and then they start reading blogs. So blogs published around that time tend to be the top of their feed reader, and that's the ones that they tend to read most often. But if you look at comments per day, you see that Saturdays and Sundays, again, are a big spike. I'm not a huge fan of using comments as a goal metric, right? And if you've heard my other presentations on like conversation, you'll know why. But if you are looking to stimulate comments, I, as a blog reader, have more time to comment on your blog posts on Saturdays and Sundays when I don't have other work to do. And then comments by hour, you see, they tend to be a little bit earlier than the views by hour spike. And then links per day, that is the number of links pointed at a blog post based on the day of the week that it was published. You see that it's typically the week that's pretty good. Sundays isn't horrible, and Friday and Saturdays aren't great, because when you're talking about links, you're talking about a special kind of web user. Rand Fishkin calls them linkerati. They're not the normal web user. They're typically very savvy. They're typically running their own websites. And when they run their own websites, they're not necessarily interested in, or they don't have the same kind of viewing patterns that just a normal web viewer would have. They're looking for content to publish on their website because they want to hit the views per day spike, right? So they want to have content up at 10 a.m. on Monday morning so that everybody will come in and read it, right? And so that's why you see that on Fridays, they're not going to be looking for stuff because they may not publish so much on the weekends. But then come Sunday night, they're looking for stuff to publish on Monday morning, and I think that's borne out in the by hour link data. In that, links by hour tend to spike much earlier than the 10 a.m. views spike because people are up early. If you're a blogger, you're up much earlier trying to write some content to get it out for 10 a.m. so that your site gets the most views. So if you are a blogger and you're interested in getting links for your site, the key is to actually publish super early in the morning. I actually publish just after midnight Eastern time. Publish super early in the morning, so that way when the linkerati wakes up, which tends to be a little bit earlier, they'll see your content and they'll be much more likely to link to it because it'll be available to them when they're looking for something to link to. And then when talk about frequency, again, when you look at unique views per month, that's the orange bar, and then the gray bar is links as reported by Yahoo, and you compare blogs that post fewer than once a day and blogs that post more than once a day, you see there is a huge positive difference. Now, I realize even getting to one post per day is a lot for most bloggers. So generally when people ask me again, how much should I be blogging? My answer is always the same, more than you are now. But if you can break that one post per day barrier, that's when blogs really start to skyrocket. That's when they become cornerstones, fundamental news sources for their industry. When they go from once a day or less than once a day to more than once a day, that's when people start checking and rechecking multiple times a day, start looking to this site as the preeminent site for breaking news and for commentary and for things that happen throughout the day. All right. So if you can, try to blog more often, and really, if you can, definitely try to aim for more than one post per day, because that's when you really start to see a ton of activity. And then when you get out to a lot of posts per day, like the Mashable level of posts per day, the amount of traffic that you'll see and the amount of views that you see tends to really skyrocket past that. So really focus on frequency when you're talking about blogging. And then again, the other thing with frequency for any of these channels, as you increase the frequency, say you're tweeting other people's links so that you can just get more retweets, get more followers, etc. If you start tweeting a lot more links, or if you start Facebooking a few more things, you start emailing a few more things, you start blogging a few more things, that will give you more chances to experiment. And the more experimentation you're doing, experimentation is always going to move you in the right direction. That's just how it works, how the scientific method works. So the more chances you have to experiment, the higher your content publishing frequency is, the better and the faster your experimentation will result in better results. So simply by the act of experimenting, frequency is Very important and will lead to more results. So that's the end of Side Chat this week in our discussion of timing. I look forward to seeing all you guys in the Facebook group. Group is called Side Chat. Search for it on Facebook. You'll find it. And I will talk to you guys again next week. Thank you, everybody.